All right, today we're going to talk about adulthood. I'm going to make this full screen for you real quick. There are several components of adulthood, and the first ones that I want to talk about is that we break adulthood into three different periods: young adulthood, middle age, and late adulthood. And so when we talk about the question of like when does adulthood begin, adulthood can be thought of as a period of life from early 20s until old age and death. Exactly when adulthood begins is not really easy to determine. Some people associate adulthood with being, at the end of high school when you graduate. Some people see it as when you graduate from college, or if you don't go to college, when you actually receive a stable job that can provide a lucrative lifestyle. And some people even think that adulthood is reached after you've reached puberty. So when we talk about adulthood in our three categories, we can go ahead and start to discuss, our physical development. So I'm going to give you a quick bit of information. When we talk about young adulthood with physical changes, it's relatively minimal. We are at our physical peak in our mid-20s, so probably between 24, 25, 26, 27, you're at your peak abilities physically. Also, sharp senses. All five senses are very sharp. You have fewer insecurities, and you have very mature cognitive abilities in your 20s. The bad news is that even in our 20s, we start to show aging around our eyes and in our neck and areas like that. But for the most part, we don't really have a lot of physical changes that occur. The 30s, when we're in our 30s, we don't really have noticeable changes, but by the time we get to our 40s, you're going to see a little bit of a decline in vision and in hearing. Not to the point where you need hearing aids, but in our 40s, our eyes and our lens, it kind of hardens, and so it's harder for it to shape and kind of analyze and shift focus. And you may have some slight hearing loss in your 40s and 50s, but it usually isn't typically noticeable with adults until they're in their 60s and 70s, which easily could be remedied by a hearing aid. Our skin eventually will show more wrinkles in your 40s and 50s. Your hair will turn gray or fall out, and your vision and hearing will decline, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. Physical strength begins to decline in your 40s. Weight may increase just depending on the fact that, as we get older as adults, we slow down. We may not be as physically active, but we're still kind of practicing similar eating habits. And then what's interesting about height is that height begins to decrease with about a half an inch of height loss for every 10 years past 40. So, if you make it to 70, you lose an inch and a half of height. Two components that come along with aging, especially in your middle age and your late adulthood, is menopause. So when we talk about menopause, that is when women stop ovulating and they stop having menstrual cycles, which means that they are unable to produce children any longer. And then men can also have andropause, which is just a gradual change in their sexual hormones and the reproductive system. Now, men can still have reproductive health or the possibility of reproduction for the rest of their lives, but typically there's a little bit of a decline in the hormone of testosterone in their body and things like that as we age. Some common health problems that show up in middle age are high blood pressure, skin cancer, heart problems, arthritis, and obesity. But like I said, with modern medicine today and things like that, if people try to maintain themselves and practice good health habits, that some of those things like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and things like that can be avoided. When we talk about the life expectancy around the world, the average age is 69.6. In the United States, we're projected to live to 79.2. What we have going on in the world right now is a decreasing birth rate and an increasing life expectancy. So we're living longer and we're having less children. And a lot of times females typically outlive males, and we have already talked about that previously in class about emotions and stressors and releasing stress, and that men are not as likely culturally to relieve stress like women do. So when we talk about cognitive abilities, intellectual abilities, intelligence, it doesn't really decline overall in life, no matter how old you are. But one thing that does change is the speed of processing, or reaction time will slow down. Compared to younger adults, middle-aged person may take longer to solve a problem, but the middle-aged person has more life experience and knowledge to bear the problem or to try to sit there and critically think in relation to a younger individual who may not have the chops to kind of bear a long-term problem because they haven't experienced that before. And the thing about that is like if you're able to bear and critically think for a longer period of time in relation to a problem, that can kind of counterbalance speed. So a couple of things that happen with memory, the difficulty in retrieval for older adults doesn't necessarily always mean that they're having a physical decline or they ultimately have Alzheimer's. It's immediately that's the diagnosis, but it's usually not. A lot of times it's likely caused by the stress middle-aged people face, because there's so much information that they have to handle. There's so much stress, and information that they have to keep straight on a regular basis. But there's lots of things that people do to keep their brains young, like they do crossword puzzles. You can play brain games, things like that. But also being active, reading, having an active social life, going to play sports, taking classes, learning a new hobby, things like that can keep your brain young. So, when we talk about intelligence, there are two different types of intelligence, which the first one is crystallized and the second one is fluid. So crystallized is, I like to think of a crystal. It's very solid intelligence that we hold on to and it is there forever. And then fluid intelligence tends to decrease in late adulthood, but it's things that we kind of learn on the fly. Like, I always think about, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's very fluid intelligence for me because I don't use the order of operations anymore in my life. Can I recite it? Yes. Can I put it into play? No. Do I know how to open a can, though? Yes, I do, and I will never forget how to do that. That's crystallized for me because it's a skill. It's a necessity. Take a moment to yourself and think of a couple of examples. When we talk about social development, there are several things that come into play. We talk about the midlife crisis, which was mentioned in class today, where adults get to a point where they may feel like they are stagnant or not happy and that they have to change or adjust their life because it's not where they want it to be. And so that can manifest itself in a new motorcycle, a sports car, or a new significant other. It just depends. When we talk about social clocks are timelines that are placed upon us by society. So an example would be, oh, you got married. When are you going to have a baby? Make sure you don't have a baby before you're 40. You need to have it before you're 40 because you're going to be too old to have a baby. Or when are you guys going to buy a house? Or when are you going to get engaged? When are you graduating from college? When are you getting that kid out of the nest? It's time for them to go. So social clocks are like these commitments or ideas that are placed on us by society of time frames of when we should have things done. And then in general, adulthood commitments, raising children, bills, finances, taxes, taking care of our elderly parents are things that we face in our adulthood commitments. So when we talk about the stages, these are Erickson's 8 stages that you learned about, that you've read about, and that's just an image of it. You can go back in the Prezi and look at it as well. And then when we talk about the couple of stages that do fit into adulthood, the first one is intimacy versus isolation. So when you think about intimacy versus isolation, you have to decide you're going to decide, and this usually happens in your 20s and 30s, are you going to have relationships with other people? Like, are you going to have close friends? Are you going to have a significant other? Are you going to have intimacy? And remember, when we talk about intimacy, it's not cue the saxophone music, but intimacy is like an emotional and not physiological, that's physical, so psychological closeness that is based on the ability to trust, share, and care while still maintaining a sense of yourself. So you're still you, but you have a boyfriend or girlfriend or a husband or wife. You're still you, but you have a good group of friends, girlfriends, guy friends, whatever. And that they know things about you and they understand you and they respect you in the space that you're in. And so when we talk about intimacy, that's when we're tapping in and we're making these close relationships. And isolation would be if we moved away from it. So a lot of times they say adults who are unsuccessful in intimacy and they are isolated, they fail and they will feel isolated from other people and may suffer from loneliness on a regular basis. People who are pretty typical, like successful in intimacy, they will have satisfying intimate relationships with friends, family, and significant others. All right. Now, generativity versus stagnation. Middle-aged adults learn to be creative in nurturing a future generation. So this deals a lot with raising children. Middle adulthood, this deals with middle adulthood, which would be your 40s or 50s. The challenge is to be creative, and it is to be nurturant of the next generation. Now, an adult who is successful in this challenge will be creative, productive, and nurturant therefore benefiting themselves, their family, their community, their country, and their future generations. So if you think about your parents being in their 40s and 50s and they're very active in the community and planning in the community or volunteering at your school, they are making a difference. Okay, if they do fundraisers for the community, they're making a difference. But midlife crisis can also occur at this time, which is stagnation. So my example there is that adults who fail will be passive. They will be self-centered. They will feel that they have done nothing for the next generation and feel that the world is no better off with them being alive. It's a little dramatic there, but it is how people can feel. 40s and 50s, you do have potential, if people feel stagnant, to have the midlife crisis as well, where they break away and try to form something new for themselves. Integrity versus despair. So usually this is our 60s and beyond. We don't want to put a tap out date on this because this is the last stage of late adulthood, and it's your 60s and beyond because people live for a very long time now. So when we talk about this is integrity versus despair. The issue is whether a person will reach wisdom, spiritual tranquility, a sense of wholeness, and the acceptance of his or her life. So people who are successful, elderly people who succeed in addressing this issue will enjoy life and not fear death. So they say, I've done good things in my life. My children are successful. I have a good life. I've done everything I wanted to do. And if I leave this earth, I will feel fulfilled. Whereas people who are unsuccessful with this will feel like they have failed, and they will feel like their lives are empty and that they will fear going towards death. They don't want to leave the earth because they haven't fulfilled what they feel like they need to do. So when we talk about the end of our lives and we talk about death, a couple things we have to talk about is that, first of all, we have to talk about dealing with mortality. When people reach late adulthood, life becomes more urgent because there's physically aging, and the end of life can be harder and harder to ignore because you grow closer to it. And so when we even talk about Erickson, he believed that at this time people look back at their life and they call it a process of life review. And they must deal with their mistakes, their regrets, and their unfinished business. And if people look back and feel that their lives are relatively full, they can come to terms with it. But if not, they'll feel despair. So when we talk about the last thing, which is the stages of death and dying, and so I'm going to go really quick over this because I don't want this video to be too long, but Elizabeth Kolberg-Ross is going to theorize that people go through 5 stages of reaction when faced with death. The first one she talks about, the first stage, is denial. Second stage is anger. Third is bargaining. 4 is depression. And 5 is acceptance. So when we talk about the end of life or mortality, we talk about how people deny, in which they refuse to believe that the diagnosis of death is real. Anger, which is really anger at death itself, and the feelings of helplessness that they cannot change things because the end is near. Bargaining, in which the dying person tries to deal with the doctors or even with God. And depression, which is sadness from losses already experienced, like a loss of a job or one's dignity. And for those yet to come, not being able to finish seeing your child grow up, or not being able to finish seeing your grandchildren grow up. And finally, acceptance is when the person has accepted the inevitable and quietly awaits death. So, sometimes people don't have the time to go through these stages, but the people on the other side do, who have lost the individual. But when we talk about diagnosis and life, anything's very possible with aging. So there's a couple of theories of aging that you might want to look up, and I'm going to list them here, and if you don't get them, play it again and repeat. Cellular clock theory, I would look that up. Wear and tear theory, as well as free radical theory. I would look those 3 theories up in relation to aging. And there's also one more theory that you might want to look up in relation to aging, which is the activity theory. So this is all I have for adulthood. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, please rewind and play or email.